let's have a word about Turkey. I mean, you are one of the people in Sweden that are most often consulted about the situation in and around Turkey, which of course is increasingly important not only for the Swedish government and to a large extent civil society, but also Swedish industry and commerce. All are interested and to a certain extent dependent upon stability and peace and prosperity in that part of the world.
Yes. What I would start saying is that I have been following Turkish affairs first as ambassador, but that was the late 90s, and then after a period of dealing with other countries, then again about Turkey since 2012 or something. At that time, early 2012-13, that period, Turkey was still in its image benefiting from a range of factors making it extremely interesting to the business community and politically generally, because of its location, because of its resources, having NATO's second largest army, having a very profoundly developed defense industry, and then this geographic location from the Bosporus to the border with Syria. So the location, its history and its resources, and the then government seeming to be able and willing to lift Turkey into something that it had never been able to be because of internal tensions. And then since that time, around 12-13, Turkey has been entering a downward spiral in many ways. And in today's situation, you have a government, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's government, that is seen to be increasingly, if not fully, authoritarian. They are facing in a few days a very crucial event, which is a rerun of elections in Istanbul, the by far largest city, not only in Turkey, but in Europe, 15 million or so people. It is 30 at least % of the population. It is a large chunk of the Turkish economy, and it's a rerun from the local elections held in end of March, which was in itself a follow-up on another round of elections. So Turkish politics, Turkish democracy, if you like, and therefore and thereby indirectly its links to the West and elsewhere are at stake. At the same time, you have a situation where a conflict with the US and indirectly with NATO over the issue of the Turkish decision to procure Russian-made air defense systems S-400, and Turkish government has made it clear that they will indeed. It's a done deal. It cannot be revoked, and the U.S. on its side has, with increasing clarity, explained that if they do so, then there will be sanctions from the U.S. side, which in turn will be very, very harmful to the already fledgling Turkish economy, now in recess, and the lira suffering a lot from events in recent years. So you have on the foreign policy side that as a main problem, and it will affect Turkish relations to NATO as a whole, because it does mean taking a stand towards Russia at the expense of traditional links to the West. And at the same time, you have the quagmire in Syria, where Turkey is deeply involved in a deeply problematic way. So you have a very dramatic situation with different issues combining to make the situation for Turkey right now very difficult.
Can I ask you, I remember that the slogan some years back was that Turkey should have no problems in its foreign relations. And then people came back and said, well, they seem to have problems in all foreign relations. How is the situation right now?
Well, the situation, the quote is from the former Prime and Foreign Minister Davutoglu saying zero problems with all neighbors, and now being replaced with, as you say, with lots of problems with all neighbors. It's a paradox. It's a humoristic way of depicting something very important. In today's world, Turkey has friends in Qatar, in Azerbaijan, and you could say Hamas in the Gaza Strip as a sort of non-state actor, and then Venezuela, paradoxically. But on all other scores, you have a heated up link or set of problems with all other neighbors. With Greece, with Cyprus, and that is both historical crisis plus the new carbon energy findings in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the tendency for the EU countries and the EU collectively to stand in support of the Greek part of it, which is very harmful to Turkey-EU relations. So you have the problems with the EU over the accession process, which has come down to zero in many ways. But the formalities here are very important. I mentioned the US, Saudi Arabia, the competitor for hegemony in this Sunni Islamic world, although Turks are Turks and Saudis are Arabs. You have a complicated relationship with Iran, a mix of dependency and competition. Yes, you have stronger links with Russia now, but everyone knows that links to Russia can never be a replacement for traditional links with the West, and instead it can be a very difficult hostage situation. And then there is Armenia with Russian troops present, and there is Israel with a strong element of hostility popping up now and then, but also permanent. And then there is Egypt, whose former democratically elected President Morsi died in a prison cage the other day. And in all provinces of Turkey and all mosques, and there are, I think, some 90,000 mosques in Turkey, there have been funerals in absentia, mourning Morsi, who was a good friend and whose ouster coincided in Turkey with the famous Gezi Park demonstrations at the time, making President Erdogan make that comparison in a way. So Turkey has lots and lots of problems with its neighbors and in foreign policy generally.
And the question that comes to my mind then is, given the fact that I think having had less to do with Turkey than you, but still worked with Turks in many different multilateral and other contexts over the last 30 years or so, I have enormous respect for Turkish diplomacy and for Turkish knowledge about security policy issues. They play a prominent role in many international organizations, including in NATO and the OSCE, etc., etc. But it seems as if most of the advice that has come up the ladder, so to say, from the security policy expertise in that eminent and large country with some 80 million inhabitants, I suppose, have they been disregarded, or is this a deliberate choice on the part of Mr. Erdogan to sort of thrive on conflict and of sort of projecting problems abroad in order to increase his stability and reassurance as a leader at home?
You can answer this on many levels. One level is to say that the purge that has been going on in the internal Sunni Turkish struggle between Erdoganists and Gülenists, that other alternative movement, as you know, whose leader is in the US, by the way, that has resulted recently in the imprisonment of a number of diplomats that were recruited during the time when Mr. Ahmet Davutoglu was foreign minister, and they were detained, and then there has been widespread and I think rather credible information handed out that they were tortured while being imprisoned. So that is an episode in recent weeks only. Generally speaking, I would say I too have had great admiration for Turkish diplomacy. They had to be good because the task of Turkish diplomats has always traditionally been a rather tough one of defending positions which were often at odds with mainstream Western values on various things. Now, with the new government and its purges after the attempted coup, affecting also diplomats, and a recruitment process of pro-government diplomats replacing traditional diplomats has made many now say that the status of and the standard of Turkish diplomats is nowadays something quite different from what it used in the past. I can also add that what I've seen now of attempts by Turkish diplomats to often angrily defend the current Turkish positions on various things is they have to put up a brave face in many ways, and you can see that they may not fully trust what they're saying, but it's a line, and they have to follow the line. And the Turkish diplomatic corps has become highly politicized to reflect the current realities in Turkey today. So it's a sad development, if you ask me.
Yeah. Well, if you look from Brussels or from Europe in general in that direction, we used to have in the European Union two policies of neighborhood. One, an Eastern Partnership, and then we used to have a Mediterranean Union policy or a Barcelona process, or looking to the south. And as we now in Sweden, and you and I together, work on trying to look at the conflict potential and situation for Sweden in this perspective, in this overarching European perspective, I'm struck by the idea that was put forward in EU neighborhood policy some maybe 10 years ago, that we don't have two neighborhoods, we have one neighborhood. And that there is a seamless transition from the eastern neighborhood going down to the southern, and a problem in the southern neighborhood might soon become a problem in the eastern neighborhood, and thereby coming much closer to us. So not only do we have problems directly from the south, but we also have problems from the east that may originate in the transition to. So what role does Turkey? You mentioned the S-400 as an example of a problem that could heaten up and degrade the coherence of NATO, heating up conflict and tensions. How do you see this? Has this become more of a reality in the last 10 years, or is it something that has always been there?
I think there is an element of permanence in it, but I think I see it accelerating. If you mean the indivisibility of security in those very sub regions, because there are so many links. Let me take one example. In a few days ago, there was a meeting of the Med7. Which is a sub-unit from EU countries with partner countries in the mainly Eastern Mediterranean, with participation of France and other European countries with interest there. And they put up a declaration which actively supported the Greek Cypriot position, which was, of course, as always, supported by Greece, and Tsipras in Greece is now facing elections in July, so maybe that has something to do with it. But I see a tendency of greater or on the part of some EU countries participation in and part of a polarized situation where where there is a linking up of several actors against Turkey, because again of Turkey's odd man out position in this particular case in support of the interests of North Cyprus. But that area around Cyprus and about the exploration of carbon findings in the Eastern Mediterranean, which also involves Israel, maybe also Egypt, but all somehow having joint interests with the support of at least many EU countries and also indirectly the US. That is in itself also linked to Black Sea problems, because in the Black Sea, where there is a huge interest on the part of NATO and the US, Russia has reinforced its armaments in the Crimea since its annexation of it, thereby dominating the Black Sea, thereby preventing NATO from power projection possibilities through the Bosporus, and for the Russian Navy to project power in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Syria. They need passage. They need an unchanged Montreux Declaration from 1936. So I see many links that make it obvious that this whole greater region belongs, and that this will have a big impact on the whole of the EU. That includes Sweden. And by the way, if you speak about Turkey, there is also the fact that Turkey's location and policies make it a critically important player in the migration policy situation, and also concerning terror spread. Turkey is a transition country because of its location. So there are many issues that makes this a coherent whole, and will make it impossible for the EU to compartmentalize various sub-direction. It's an adjacent. It's a whole in security terms, I would say.
So, rounding up this podcast, in the last 2 minutes, maybe we should have a word about to what extent this is just an issue of power politics, or a battle for resources and geostrategic considerations, or to what extent it also is an issue of values and religions and faith and belief systems. To what extent do these issues of values, the fact that Turkey, as all other European countries, have signed up to very extensive commitments in the Council of Europe, in the OSCE and elsewhere, in NATO itself, I suppose, to what extent does this play a real role in the considerations of the main actors interacting with Turkey at the
Hard to say, but for many in Europe, people like Sarkozy of France and others, Turkey has always been the odd man out, being a large Muslim country, which would be in like a cuckoo egg in a small bird's nest, in a way. That's been the perception. I would say that nowadays that plays a smaller role, because the other side of the coin was always that in order to integrate Turkey into a whole European Union as a result of enlargement, it would be a demonstration to the world that the EU is open to various cultures and religions. It's not a Christian club which will exclude all others. That has been the argument, the motivation for example, the Swedish government for a long time, being advocates of integration of Turkey. Nowadays, with the huge problems of foreign policy, as we talked about, and also about human rights, rule of law, basic values like this, has alienated Turkey so much, both from a European community but also a transatlantic community, that I would say that the factor of religion and culture has been reduced to something of less importance because of the preeminence, dominance of these other factors.
Yeah. So in the end, one can express certain sadness. I remember maybe 10 years ago in Brussels and in Vienna discussing the future of EU enlargement and the question whether Turkey could ever become a member of the European Union. When a Turkish ambassador told me that, yes, I think it could become a member of the European Union were it not for one problem, namely Cyprus. That was at that point the only issue which he considered to be almost prohibitive thing to stand in the way for a full Turkish integration into the European Union. At the same time, of course, he expressed pessimism for the simple reason that Turkey is such a large country and would change the balance in the entire Union in a way which would be unpredictable perhaps for some of the present major players in the EU, and even more unpredictable after Brexit.
Yeah. After all, one of the criteria of enlargement was digestibility, and of course, to digest Turkey was always seen to be problematic. But in the past, there was a lamentation in Europe about the slow progress of Turkey in the right direction. Now there is regrets of a fast moving away from in the wrong direction, so to speak. So things have really changed. In Cyprus, I'm afraid that the chances that were perceived only last year to be for a solution to be within reach has now somehow been carried away into the currents of this Eastern Mediterranean drama. So I don't think many have strong beliefs that the Cyprus thing will be solved anytime soon. So that's another thing which makes foreign policy life for Turkey more problematic now.
So let's come back to, in later podcasts, the issue about the Swedish posture to this, which is, of course, a major issue very complicated in many dimensions. But already this analysis that you have provided gives ample food for thought about the complexity of security policy, way beyond the sort of simple analysis, a seemingly simple analysis of the East-West confrontation in Europe.
And we also have to add in a later podcast the situation in Syria and in the wider Middle East as such, because that belongs also to all this. But for now, that's fine. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You are listening to an e-learning light podcast produced by Lars-Erik Lundin for Lundin och Bäcklund AB. Copyright on and around the topic of Europe and security. Please do subscribe on the Lars-Erik Lundin channels on SoundCloud or YouTube. Thank you. Also, do visit the ellilundin.org website and follow on @Lundin on Twitter.